In a quiet Springfield home, the family's favorite Gatorade didn't just provide hydration, it delivered a methodical, agonizing death. Diane Staudte wasn't a stereotypical monster. She was a church organist, a nurse, and a mother who viewed her husband and children as administrative burdens to be deleted. With the clinical precision of her profession and the silence of a prayer, she began pruning her family tree, one antifreeze-laced drink at a time, until only the useful ones remained. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Springfield, Missouri, often called the Queen City of the Ozarks, carries a specific brand of Midwestern stillness, a place where the rhythms of life are dictated by the change of seasons and the steady tolling of church bells. In the early 2000s, the house on North Golden Avenue appeared to be just another unremarkable node in this social fabric. It was a modest, single-story residence, shaded by mature trees that cast long, skeletal shadows across a lawn that was rarely perfectly manicured. To the neighbors, the Staudtes were a large, perhaps slightly eccentric family, but they were anchored by the presence of a woman who seemed to be the very definition of reliability. Diane Staudte was 51 years old, a woman whose life was a masterclass in efficiency and community service. She was a registered nurse, a profession that demanded a high degree of clinical detachment and a stomach for the macabre realities of the human body. When she wasn't at the hospital, she was often found seated at the massive organ of the Redeemer Lutheran Church. There, her hands moved with practiced precision across the keys, filling the sanctuary with hymns that spoke of salvation and divine order. To those in the pews, Diane was the backbone of the congregation, sturdy, quiet, and deeply committed to the structure of her faith and her family. She was the primary breadwinner, the one who navigated the complexities of insurance, bills, and the daily logistics of a six-person household. However, inside the walls of the North Golden Avenue home, the air was thick with a different kind of tension, a heavy, stagnant frustration that Diane found increasingly difficult to breathe. Her husband, Mark Staudte, was in many ways her polar opposite. Mark was a local fixture in the Springfield music scene, the lead singer and guitarist for a band called The Freaks. He was a man of charisma and creative energy, often seen with a guitar strapped to his back and a laid-back attitude that bordered on the terminal. While Diane spent her days in the sterile, high-stakes environment of a hospital, Mark spent much of his time in the basement or at local dives, chasing the fading echoes of a musical career that never quite hit the big time. To the outside world, he was the cool dad, the guy who brought a bit of rock and roll flair to the suburbs. To Diane, he was a drain, a man who contributed little to the family's financial stability and whose laziness felt like a personal insult to her own tireless work ethic. The children only added to the perceived weight on Diane's shoulders. Shaun, the eldest at 26, was a quiet, introverted young man who lived at home. He struggled with a range of social and developmental issues, often withdrawing into his own world. Sarah, 24, was equally difficult in Diane's estimation. She was frequently unemployed, struggling to find her footing in adulthood, and her presence in the house felt like a permanent fixture that Diane hadn't authorized. Then there was Rachel, the 22-year-old who seemed to be the only one Diane could tolerate, perhaps because Rachel shared her mother's musical talent and a certain icy, observant nature. Brianna, the youngest, was still trying to navigate the chaotic energy of a home where the parents were increasingly becoming strangers to one another. As the months rolled into 2012, Diane's internal monologue began to shift. The resentment wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-growing mold, silent and invasive. She looked at Mark and saw a man she no longer respected. She looked at Shaun and Sarah and saw problems that would never be solved, only managed at her expense. In her mind, she wasn't just a mother and a wife. She was an administrator of a failing enterprise. The house felt cluttered, not just with physical objects, but with the annoyances of human needs that she was tired of meeting. The financial pressure of being the sole reliable earner, combined with the emotional exhaustion of managing 3 adult children who seemed to have no exit strategy, pushed Diane toward a terrifyingly pragmatic conclusion. She didn't want a divorce. That was messy, expensive, and socially embarrassing for a woman of her standing in the church. She didn't want to simply walk away. That would leave her with nothing. Instead, she began to view her family through the same clinical lens she used at the hospital. If a limb was gangrenous, you removed it to save the body. If a person was a burden, they were an inefficiency to be corrected. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of Mark's guitar from the basement, and the constant, demanding presence of her children became a cacophony she decided to silence. She began to spend more time on the family computer, her nursing background guiding her towards substances that were common, easy to obtain, and, most importantly, difficult to detect in a routine autopsy. She wasn't looking for a weapon of passion. She was looking for a tool, something that could be administered slowly, mirroring the natural decline of a body, so that when the end came, it would look like a tragedy rather than a crime. The Queen City remained still, unaware that its most reliable organist was beginning to compose a final, lethal requiem for the people she was supposed to love most. The atmosphere inside the Staudte residence wasn't merely one of domestic friction. It was an ecosystem of silent, escalating contempt. In this house of six, an invisible line had been drawn, bifurcating the family into two distinct camps: the burdens and the planners. At the center of this chilling division was the bond between Diane and her second youngest daughter, Rachel. While the other children were seen as failures or complications, Rachel was the protege. She was the one who shared her mother's aptitude for music and, more importantly, her mother's terrifyingly detached worldview. Together, they formed a coalition of two against a world they deemed beneath them, and eventually against the very people who shared their DNA. Diane's resentment for her husband, Mark, had long since curdled into a cold, administrative hatred. To her, Mark wasn't just a failing musician or a lazy partner. He was a faulty component in her life's machinery. She viewed his presence in the basement, surrounded by the cluttered remains of his musical ambitions, as a personal affront to her own orderly existence. The sound of his guitar, once perhaps a source of attraction, now served as a constant, rhythmic reminder of his perceived uselessness. She felt that she was subsidizing a life that contributed nothing back to the ledger. In her eyes, Mark was a consumer of resources, food, space, attention, without any measurable return on investment. This wasn't the fiery anger of a betrayed spouse. It was the calculated disdain of an auditor looking at a line item that needed to be erased. The annoyances did not stop with Mark. Diane's eldest son, Shaun, was 26 and lived in a state of quiet, social withdrawal that Diane found increasingly intolerable. She viewed his developmental struggles and his need for stability not with maternal compassion, but with the frustration of a woman forced to care for a broken tool. To Diane, Shaun was a problem that refused to resolve itself. Then there was Sarah, the daughter Diane described as the epitome of laziness. Sarah's inability to maintain employment and her general lack of direction were, in Diane's estimation, a drain on the family's potential. Diane didn't see children in need of guidance. She saw a collection of things that were cluttering her path to a simplified, quiet life. It was within this shared headspace of elitist frustration that the bond with Rachel deepened. They were the intelligent ones, the talented ones. They would sit together, often in the kitchen or during long drives to church events, and discuss the state of the household with the clinical coldness of two generals discussing a failed battalion. Rachel didn't just listen to her mother's grievances, she validated them. She mirrored Diane's disgust, reinforcing the idea that the rest of the family was holding them back. This reinforcement was the catalyst that turned Diane's dark thoughts into a concrete objective. The why was simple. The house was too noisy, the bills were too high, and the people were too much. The how would become a shared project, a dark bonding exercise between mother and daughter. The transition from complaining about the family to planning their elimination happened in the quietest of increments. There were no shouting matches, only whispers over tea and secretive searches on the family computer. They began to research methods of medical correction that wouldn't draw the attention of the authorities. Diane's nursing background was the skeleton key that unlocked the plan. She knew the limits of standard toxicology screens and the symptoms of common illnesses. They needed something that could be integrated into the family's daily routines, something that looked like a natural, if tragic, decline. They eventually settled on ethylene glycol, antifreeze. It was cheap, easy to find in any hardware store or garage, and possessed a sickly sweet taste that could be easily masked by the sugary beverages the family favored. But it wasn't just about the poison, it was about the protocol. Diane and Rachel treated the upcoming murders like a household chore list. They discussed the order of operations, who would go first, and how the survivors would react to maintain the illusion of a grieving family. They decided that Mark would be the primary target. The head of the Burdens would be the first to fall. This period of the Staudte household was perhaps the most haunting. To the neighbors and the church congregation, nothing had changed. Diane still played the organ, her notes soaring through the rafters of the Redeemer Lutheran Church, while Rachel stood by her side. But back on North Golden Avenue, the planners were beginning to prepare the first doses. They watched Mark from the shadows of the hallway, observing his habits, waiting for the right moment to slip the first drop of medical mystery into his drink. There was a sickening sense of superiority in their silence, a feeling that they were the masters of fate, and the rest of the family were merely players in a play that was reaching its final act. The resentment had been codified into a plan, and the annoyances were about to be addressed, one by one, with the icy pragmatism that had become the Staudte family's true hidden legacy. The medical mystery that began to unfold inside the house on North Golden Avenue was not a mystery at all. It was a controlled experiment in human endurance. It started in the early spring of 2012, just as the Missouri landscape was beginning to thaw. The weapon of choice was deceptively simple: ethylene glycol, a common automotive coolant found in every garage in Springfield. It was clear, odorless, and carried a syrupy sweetness that blended perfectly into the high-fructose world of American soft drinks. For Diane Staudte, the transition from nurse to executioner was as smooth as the liquid she began to measure into her husband's favorite beverages. Mark Staudte was the first to experience the flu that never seemed to end. In late March, the charismatic guitarist, the man who lived for the stage, found himself unable to even walk up the stairs from his basement sanctuary. It began with a persistent, nagging nausea that he initially dismissed as a stomach bug, or perhaps the result of a few too many late nights at the local bars. But this was different. It was a heavy, systemic sickness that seemed to settle in his very marrow. He described a feeling of profound lethargy, a fog that descended over his mind, making even the simplest chords on his guitar feel like a complex mathematical equation he could no longer solve. Diane, ever the dutiful nurse, was right there to provide care. She was the one who brought him his drinks, bottles of bright orange Gatorade and cans of soda, insisting that he stay hydrated. She watched with clinical detachment as he tilted his head back and swallowed the very substance that was systematically crystallizing in his kidneys. Ethylene glycol is a patient killer. Once ingested, the body metabolizes it into glycolic acid and then oxalic acid, which binds with calcium to form microscopic, needle-like crystals. These crystals act like internal shrapnel, shredding the delicate tissues of the renal system and the brain. By the first week of April, Mark was a shadow of himself. He was bedridden, suffering from intense chest pains and a shortness of breath that made every word a struggle. He told his wife he felt like he was drowning on dry land. On Easter Sunday, while the rest of Springfield was celebrating renewal and life, Mark Staudte took his last agonizing breath. He died in his bed, surrounded by the family he was supposedly burdening. Because of Diane's reputation as a nurse and her calm, professional demeanor, the attending physicians and the coroner didn't suspect foul play. They saw a man in his 50s with a history of a somewhat rock and roll lifestyle and chalked it up to natural causes, a heart attack or a sudden systemic failure. Diane insisted on a quick cremation, effectively incinerating the primary evidence of her crime before the ashes had even cooled. The house was quieter after Mark was gone, but for Diane and Rachel, it wasn't quiet enough. The pruning had only just begun. The summer of 2012 passed in a strange, hollow peace, but as the humidity of the Missouri August began to peak, the focus shifted to 26-year-old Shaun. Shaun was the quiet one, the son who lived in the margins of the family dynamic. He didn't have the social circle Mark had, and he didn't have the voice to protest when he too began to feel the same flu that had taken his father. The symptoms mirrored Mark's with terrifying accuracy. First came the vomiting, violent, racking bouts that left Shaun dehydrated and trembling on the bathroom floor. Then came the confusion. He would wander through the house in a daze, unable to remember what he had been doing or where he was going. Diane and Rachel watched him with a curiosity that bordered on the macabre. They reportedly discussed how much antifreeze it would take to finish the job this time, curious if a young man's body would resist the poison more than an older one's. They treated Shaun's decline like a case study, documenting his seizures and his fading motor skills. In early September, Shaun's body finally gave out. He was found dead in his room, his organs having essentially shut down after weeks of being bathed in toxin. Again, the grieving mother played her part to perfection. She spoke to the authorities with a weary, tragic grace, lamenting the genetic curse that seemed to be taking her family. Once again, there was no autopsy. Once again, the body was rushed to the crematorium. Within 6 months, Diane had effectively erased 2 people from her life, and she had done so without a single drop of blood being spilled on her carpets. But the arrogance of the successful criminal is a dangerous thing. In the spring of 2013, Diane turned her sights on her daughter, Sarah. Sarah was 24, and in Diane's mind, she was the ultimate annoyance. The one who refused to leave, the one who contributed nothing. The protocol remained the same. The Gatorade bottles appeared, the hydration was enforced, and soon Sarah was suffering from the familiar, agonizing symptoms. She complained of blinding headaches and a numbness in her limbs that made it impossible for her to stand. However, Sarah's body fought back in a way the men's hadn't. By May 2013, she was in critical condition, her heart rate plummeting and her kidneys failing. Diane, perhaps feeling invincible after 2 successful murders, made the mistake of taking Sarah to the hospital. She likely expected Sarah to die in the ICU, another natural tragedy to add to her collection. She didn't account for the fact that doctors in a modern emergency room are trained to look for patterns. And the pattern emerging from the Staudte family was beginning to look less like a tragedy and more like a massacre. While Sarah lay in a hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread, the air in the Staudte house grew cold. The planners had been too efficient. They had left behind a trail of medical mysteries that were about to collide with a very skeptical medical community. The Gatorade was gone, but the damage was done. And as Sarah's blood was sent to the lab for a comprehensive screening, the clock began to tick on the church organist's perfect, pragmatic life. When Sarah Staudte was wheeled into the emergency room at Cox South Hospital in May 2013, she was less a person and more a collapsing biological system. At 24 years old, her body was shutting down with a terrifying, inexplicable speed. Her heart rate had plummeted to 40 beats per minute, her blood pressure was cratering, and her kidneys, the vital filters of the human form, had essentially ceased to function. To the medical staff, it looked like a catastrophic case of multi-organ failure, but the underlying cause remained a ghost in the machinery. There was no trauma, no obvious infection, and no history of chronic illness that could explain why a young woman was hovering on the edge of the grave. Diane Staudte stood in the corner of the intensive care unit, watching the frantic activity of the doctors and nurses with a composure that many found unsettling. As a nurse herself, she spoke the language of the hospital. She moved through the sterile hallways with a professional ease, providing the medical team with a detailed, clinical history of Sarah's mysterious decline. She spoke about the nausea, the weakness, and the sudden onset of confusion, framing it as yet another chapter in a family history defined by tragedy. However, it was this very history, this genetic curse, that began to pull at the loose threads of Diane's carefully constructed narrative. The primary red flag wasn't found in a lab report. It was found in the social history of the patient. One of the attending physicians, struck by the gravity of Sarah's condition, began to look into the Staudte family's recent past. The discovery was staggering. Within the span of just over a year, Diane had lost her husband, Mark, and her eldest son, Shaun. Both had died suddenly. Both had suffered from vague gastrointestinal and neurological symptoms. and both had been cremated before the ink on their death certificates was even dry. To find 3 members of the same household suffering from the same rare, lethal constellation of symptoms within 14 months defied every law of medical probability. The doctors began to communicate in hushed tones behind the heavy glass of the ICU monitoring station. They weren't looking at a freak genetic anomaly anymore. They were looking at a cluster. The suspicion of foul play shifted from a dark thought to a mandatory medical inquiry. They noted that Diane's behavior didn't quite match the reality of her daughter's condition. While Sarah's brain was swelling and her body was struggling for every breath, Diane remained calm, almost administrative in her grieving process. She seemed more interested in the logistics of the situation than the emotional weight of potentially losing a 3rd family member in a year. The turning point came when the medical team decided to run a comprehensive toxicology screen, specifically looking for substances that are often missed in standard panels. They were looking for heavy metals, rare toxins, or environmental poisons. When the results finally came back from the lab, the medical mystery vanished, replaced by a cold, chemical reality. Sarah's blood was saturated with ethylene glycol. The levels were so high that it was clear this wasn't a single accidental ingestion, but a sustained, methodical poisoning. The needle-like crystals identified in her system were the physical manifestation of the antifreeze Diane had been slipping into her daughter's drinks. The discovery sent a shockwave through the hospital staff. They realized that Sarah wasn't just a patient. She was a victim of a crime currently in progress. The protocol changed instantly. No longer was Sarah just being treated, she was being protected. The medical team alerted the Springfield Police Department, reporting that they had a young woman in their care who had been poisoned with antifreeze, and that her mother, a woman with medical training, was the primary person providing her with food and drink. While the police began to assemble their team, the doctors had to maintain a delicate balance. They couldn't let Diane know they were onto her, fearing she might flee or, worse, attempt to finish the job before Sarah could speak. They watched Diane on the security monitors as she sat by Sarah's bed, perhaps wondering why her daughter was still fighting, why this particular pruning was taking so long. The hospital, once a place of healing for Diane's family, had become a surveillance trap. The red flags had all turned a deep, lethal crimson, and the investigation was no longer confined to the sterile rooms of the ICU. It was moving out into the streets of Springfield, toward the house on North Golden Avenue, and toward the digital footprints of a woman who thought she could treat human lives like clinical data points to be deleted. The Springfield Police Department is a place of functional, sterile edges, a building designed for the processing of human failure. When Detective Neil McComas sat down across from Diane Staudte in June 2013, the air in the small interrogation room was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. Diane sat with her hands folded, her posture reflecting the same composed, maternal authority she had projected from the organ bench at church. To an outside observer, she looked like a woman who had been brought in to help, not a suspect who had just been accused of a triple poisoning. But McComas, a veteran of the Ozarks' darker corners, recognized the specific unyielding stillness of a person who believed they were the smartest person in the room. The investigation had moved with a sudden, jarring momentum. While Sarah fought for her life in the hospital, police had executed a search warrant on the North Golden Avenue home. They didn't find a dramatic murder scene. Instead, they found the mundane remnants of a suburban execution. In the kitchen, tucked away behind boxes of cereal and bags of flour, were the bright, neon-colored bottles of Gatorade. When tested, these seemingly innocent beverages revealed the same chemical signature found in Sarah's blood, a lethal concentration of ethylene glycol. But the most damning evidence was digital. On the family computer, detectives discovered a history of searches that read like a recipe for a quiet massacre. They found inquiries into untraceable poisons, antifreeze poisoning symptoms, and how to kill with ethylene glycol. In the interrogation room, McComas began with a slow, rhythmic approach. He didn't lead with accusations, he led with the tragedy. He spoke about the loss of Mark and the sudden death of Shaun, watching Diane's face for the slightest tremor of genuine grief. There was none. She spoke about her husband and son with a detached, almost pitying tone, as if they were difficult patients she had finally been relieved of. When McCamus finally laid the toxicology reports on the table, the physical proof that Sarah was being systematically poisoned, the mask of the grieving nurse didn't crack. It simply shifted into a new, more terrifying shape. She eventually began to talk, her voice low and steady, lacking any inflection of remorse. She told the investigators that her life had become a series of annoyances. She described Mark as a parasite, a man who spent his days in the basement with his guitar while she worked double shifts to keep the family afloat. He was a drain on her resources and her patience. She explained that she had decided to simplify things. When McCamus pushed her on the deaths of her husband and son, she admitted to the poisonings with a terrifyingly administrative logic. She told them that Shaun was difficult and that his needs were a constant weight on her shoulders. In her mind, she wasn't a murderer. She was a gardener pruning away the dead wood to allow the rest of the tree to survive. But the investigation took an even darker turn when the focus shifted to Rachel. While Diane was being questioned, other detectives were speaking to the 22-year-old daughter who had been her mother's constant companion. They found a notebook belonging to Rachel, a journal of projects that outlined the family's elimination. It became clear that Rachel wasn't just a bystander. She was an architect. She had assisted her mother in the research, helped select the poison, and even suggested the order in which her family members should die. During her own interrogation, Rachel's detachment mirrored her mother's. She told the detectives that they had a plan to eventually move to a smaller house and live a quiet life, free from the clutter of the others. She spoke about the poisoning of her siblings and father as if she were discussing a difficult school project that she was glad to have finished. The investigators were struck by the complete lack of empathy in the room, a vacuum of humanity where maternal love and sibling bonds should have been. The why was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. It wasn't about a massive insurance payout, although the money from Mark's death certainly helped. It wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden snap. It was a purely pragmatic decision to remove human beings who Diane and Rachel felt were inconvenient. They had looked at their family members and seen only liabilities. The clinical precision with which they administered the antifreeze, watching their loved ones suffer for weeks before they finally succumbed, pointed to a level of sociopathy that Springfield had rarely seen. As the sun set over the Ozarks, Diane Staudte was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. Rachel was taken into custody shortly after. The house on North Golden Avenue was cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent monument to the family that had been pruned into oblivion. The community was left to grapple with the reality that the woman playing the hymns on Sunday morning had spent her Saturday nights measuring out poison in the kitchen. The investigation had stripped away the Midwestern veneer of the Staudte family, revealing a core of icy, calculated detachment that would haunt the city for years to come. The legal resolution for the Staudte case was as cold and efficient as the crimes themselves. To avoid the high-stakes gamble of a death penalty trial, Diane Staudte chose to plead guilty in 2016 to the first-degree murders of Mark and Shaun, as well as the targeted assault on Sarah. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a final permanent removal from the society she tried so desperately to curate into her own version of perfection. Rachel Staudte followed suit, accepting a plea deal that required her to testify against her mother if the case had ever reached a jury. She received 2 life sentences, but with the possibility of parole after serving 42.5 years. A long, slow count toward a freedom her father and brother would never see. Sarah survived the antifreeze protocol, but the damage was irreversible. The needle-like crystals had done their work, leaving her with significant neurological deficits. In the end, the pruning was complete, and the gardener was finally discarded. The Staudte case stands as a harrowing monument to the banality of evil, a narrative where the monsters sat in church pews and played the organ. Diane didn't kill for passion, she killed for convenience. This administrative approach to murder remains a terrifying outlier in criminal history. Ultimately, the Queen City was left with a grim realization. The deadliest poison wasn't the chemical in the Gatorade. It was the icy, calculated silence of a mother who looked at her family and saw only a list of chores to be deleted. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.